Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 245. What are the current Python graphical user interface libraries? Should you build everything in the terminal and create a text-based user interface instead? Christopher Trudeau is back on the show this week, bringing another batch of PyCoder's weekly articles and projects. We cover a Real Python article that explores the Textual library. Textual is a Python toolkit and framework for creating attractive and functional text-based user interface applications, or TUIs, which run in the user's terminal. The tutorial covers organizing layouts of widgets, styling components, and handling events and user actions within an application. We continue our exploration of user interface options for your projects by discussing a recent article covering Python GUI libraries. The piece compares the frameworks, showing a quick preview of how they look, and the sample code for a simple application. We both discuss our thoughts and experiences with several of the libraries as we go through the collection. We also share several other articles and projects from the Python community, including a news roundup, handling binary data in Python, exploring the rules terminal programs follow, using Microsoft Edge's online text-to-speech service from Python, and a project for reading and writing compressed JSON. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Welcome back, Christopher.
Hey there.
So we have a bunch of news.
Yes.
And we have our typical topics and a few projects. Let's dig into the news.
Yeah, like you said, pretty newsy week this week. I'll start out with a couple of posts from the PyCon US folks. As a reminder, PyCon US is in Pittsburgh this year from May 14th to the 22nd, so it's coming up quickly. They were busy on their blog recently, starting with an explanation about how travel grants work. So the conference sets aside some money, some of which comes out of the PSF and other things, to help with those who want to travel to the conference. This year, there were 6 times the number of requests as the budget.
Wow.
So the post basically talks about how they choose amongst the requests and how all that works to sort of try and be transparent about it. Quickly following on that post was another post, which was the announcement of the conference's refund policy for international attendees.
Yeah.
Due to the ongoing situation in the US regarding entry visas and other complications, the conference has outlined their guidelines for refunds if your visa is denied or if you're denied entry at the border. Being Canadian myself, I'm not going to say much more on that topic because I will get cranky. So let's just leave it there.
Yeah.
But if you're coming in from the US for the conference, check out the post so that you know what your options are.
Okay.
So switching gears. The next bit of news is release news, and that's coverage.py. If you've never used this, it's one of my favorite little tools. You use it with your test suites to determine how much of your code got executed by those tests. So recently, version 7.7 and its little addendum.1 came out, and the big change here is it's enabled branch coverage through sys.monitoring. So this gives you finer grained control over your coverage measurements, and this most recent patch even has been tested against 3.14 alpha, so you can get your coverage of your tests with that as well.
That leads you right into...
Look at that. There you go. Leads nicely to the announcement of 3.14 Alpha 6. You'd almost think we'd planned that segue.
Yep.
While talking about releases, Django 5.2 has hit release candidate 1. So it looks like that's going to be on time for an April release as well.
All right.
Switching topics, just to prove that I didn't plan any of those segues. I'm back on conferences now. PyOhio, which is in Cleveland on July 26th and 27th, has issued its call for proposals. If you've never spoken at a conference and you're interested in doing that, smaller regional ones like these are a great way to get some experience.
Yeah.
Proposals will be accepted until April 28th. which is when we'll be in Dublin for Django Con EU.
Yeah.
And then the final bit of news is PEP 779, titled Criteria for Supported Status for Free-Threaded Python. It has been created. I do wonder whether they just use a random word generator for some of their PEP titles. This one's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
It's a meta PEP. You may recall that when free threading was announced, the Python Software Foundation said it would release this in steps, and assuming each step past some criteria. What this PEP does is outline what those criteria are and essentially how or if we will get to the next step. So I think I'm out of breath. I relinquish my time to the honorable representative from Colorado.
All right. Well, I decided to go down an interesting path this week. We've been talking a lot about building applications and projects and things like that. And often you want to share them with people that are maybe not command line type people, you want to maybe make an interface or make it something that they can interact with and so forth. So I've kind of gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole this week. So my first one is a real Python one. It's titled Python Textual, Build Beautiful UIs in the Terminal. And boy, we've talked about Textual a bunch on the show, but this piece is by Charles de Villiers, and he's been writing for us for a few years now, kind of on and off. Usually maybe one or two pieces come out every year. But in general, we've discussed Textual, like I said, several times. In fact, I had Will McGugan on the show to discuss it back in episode 80. Will's been powering along for quite a while now, continuing to work on the library and its underlying library that it's sort of built upon, which is called Rich. It's a little subtitle here. It's a Python library for creating rich text and beautifully formatted terminal output. So ways to make your stuff inside the terminal look pretty. And Textual builds on top of that and allows you to build terminal-based applications with interactive and visually appealing text interfaces. So it's still running in a terminal window, and it's all primarily text. We use this term, we call it a TUI, a text user interface. But we'll be talking a little more about GUIs in a little bit, graphical user interfaces. So if you're more looking for something that looks a little bit more like other applications that run on your computer versus something that runs entirely in the terminal. But I think it's nice to be able to make applications for the users of your programs. I think command line interfaces will work for a certain subset of people, and you can kind of maybe give instructions, but a lot of people are much more used to this. And even though these kind of look like an older computer kind of program because it's all happening inside the terminal with text, this one gives you a lot of resources. And I think that's what's nice about this piece is that it dives into not just what it is, but like how to do different types of layouts, all the different sort of what are called widgets, these little tools that you're aligning and setting up inside of a user interface library. And so it's a good tour for that. Of course, it starts with installation, which you can pip install. In fact, something that I haven't used, mostly I've been consuming textual apps, not really creating them yet. But in this particular case, he shares installing the textual-dev, which facilitates debugging and interactive development. What I mean by that is that if you make updates to certain things, the textual dev will refresh the interface, which is kind of nice in the background, along with helping with debugging. So it kind of gives you a little faster loop of doing updates and controlling things and checking it out. You build a really simple first app, very much of a hello world, as you start to explore some of the widgets and how to style them. And then it pretty quickly leads right into styling things. What's interesting is Will McGugan decided to go down the CSS route, which you should be familiar with if you've done anything on the web, cascading style sheets. In fact, quickly moves beyond hard programming them into your Python code and into a TCSS file, so a textual CSS file. And you learn how to troubleshoot along with that using the textual dev tool. And then you pretty quickly learn, okay, I'm going to have several widgets, lots of things laid out, and you lead into what are called containers. So again, if you've used a GUI library, you might be familiar with this idea that you will have containers of widgets, things that are stacked sort of vertically and organized. Maybe they'll even have like a scroll bar for you to move up and down vertically. And similarly, you can have horizontal containers that move, again, left and right across the screen. There's a concept of a docked widget, so you can sort of lock something where you want it on the particular part of the page. And then the idea of nesting these containers inside of each other. In fact, there's even a grid container where you can have rows and columns of widgets. So you get into the interaction next, handling events inside there. So if you click on a widget that maybe is a button and you want it to do a particular event and callbacks from those different things. So it provides lots of resources here also. So as you go through the tutorial, he provides the official guide. So if you want a little bit more about practicing your skills, and then if you're interested in going a little bit further and building something, Leodonis, our friend, we feature often on the show, has built a contact app, sort of a contact book that you can build with Textual and SQLite. And so I'll include a link to that tutorial. And again, this is a modern tutorial here on Real Python, so it has a quiz so you can test your knowledge as you work through it. And again, thanks for the tour, Charles.
You mentioned Will McGugan. He's actually just done a spot on TalkPython's podcast called Algorithms for High Performance Terminal Apps.
Okay.
So if you're interested in how he makes it all go faster so that it'll all work together, might be worth a listen.
Yeah.
Also shows you that we're okay with sending you to other podcasts. So there you go.
Actually, you had mentioned that Michael Kennedy has written a book based upon some of the articles we were featuring a few months ago. And so I might have him come on the show again. Yeah, always comfortable with promoting other people's work here on the show. So what's your next one?
Speaking of other people's work, this is actually another Real Python one. This is a Bartage jam, which means a deep, deep dive.
Yeah.
Its title is Bytes Objects Handling Binary Data in Python. A lot of folks come to Python from non-coding backgrounds, or maybe you got your start in the web world, and both those places you don't have to deal with binary data all that much. It can happen, but it's rare. And so this article kind of helps you go down that path. So fundamentally, underneath everything your computer does comes down to bits and bytes. Sometimes you have to deal with data formats that are at a lower layer. This article essentially teaches you how you can do that in Python. It starts out with a primer on what binary looks like. Although it is just ones and zeros, how you group those ones and zeros together comes in several different flavors. Due to historical reasons, we tend to group the digits in a sequence 8 long, which is called a byte. An 8-bit byte corresponds to a number between 0 and 255. Sometimes. And when you translate from binary to decimal, that's what you're looking at is 0 to 255. When you want more than that, you group together the bytes. This is where it starts to get messy. Different kinds of machines store the order of multiple bytes in different orders. This is known as big and little endianness. So big endianness stores the bytes in the order you would naturally read them in English, with the most significant part first. And little endianness does the opposite, what you might consider backwards. Why, you might ask? Well, certain kinds of numeric operations treating the bytes as a stack can be helpful, so some computer hardware is actually organized this way under the covers. If all that isn't complex enough for you, you can make it even more complicated by adding the representation of negative numbers. Although 8 bits gives you between 0 and 255, you can store negative numbers in it by shifting that and splitting it in half. Mm-hmm. You can use one half for negative numbers and the other half for positive. There's a couple different ways of storing this, one of which is just to use a bit as a marker for, this is on, it's positive, this is off, it's negative. The problem with that is now you can actually have a negative 0, which doesn't make sense. So there are other ways of doing this. The most common is something called to complement. This applies a little math and then gets rid of that little negative 0 waste. So I've explained all of this as theory, but the article has snippets of Python in a REPL along the way to show you what these concepts are. So it's not just straight dry reading. And then you can sort of see how data gets manipulated as you go along. Python itself has the idea of a byte object. Through the use of this class, you can go from data types to bytes and back again. The rest of this deep article walks you through the different ways of constructing binary data in Python, performing operations on them similar to strings, like getting their sizes, finding subsets, slicing them into pieces, all that kind of good stuff. And of course, like I said, deep dive, we're only halfway at this point.
Yeah.
So the second half of the article goes into practice. It talks about the different places you might use bytes in your code, the libraries that sit on top of the byte interface that give you a higher level abstraction. So this includes things like image bitmaps, the OpenStreetMap file format, Python's own bytecode. There's a reason it's called bytecode. It's bits and bytes. And so there's plenty to dig into here if you've got the time to spend on a longer read.
Yeah. Two things I want to mention there. One is you did a course a while ago based upon one of Bartosz's earlier adventures into bits and bytes and so forth. It's titled Binary Bytes and Bitwise Operators in Python. So that might be something people might want to check out. Maybe I'll link it this week. We'll see.
Yep. And it covers a lot of the same stuff that was in the first half of the article. So if you're looking for a faster version, that might be the place to start. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other is what's half of a byte or 4 bits?
A nibble.
Yeah. I always thought that was ridiculous. I would tell my students that and they'd be like, what? 2 nibbles is a byte? And I said, yeah, in fact, when I was a kid, and showing how old I am, there was a magazine. It was called Nibble.
Yep.
Next to Byte magazine.
2 bytes are a word, which just breaks it all together. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe somebody will get the history for me. I'm pretty sure Nibble came out as a back thing.
Yeah, after.
Because if I remember correctly, I seem to remember coming across books that talked about having a 4-bit byte, and eventually the 8-bit byte just became the norm.
The thing,
and then people thought they'd be clever and say, "What's half of a byte? It's a nibble." Yeah.
And go nibble, yeah. Might be. Yeah, I mean, hexadecimal is, a pair of nibbles making a byte, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, interesting. All right, well, cool. Deep dive into that stuff. This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. If you're active on social media, then you know that images and videos are popular forms of content. And as a programmer, you mainly work with text, so sharing that content that you create on a daily basis may not seem intuitive. That's where a code image generator might come in handy. This course is titled Building a Code Image Generator with Python. And it's based on a tutorial by Real Python team member Philip Ixeni. And Philip is your video instructor for the course. And he shows you how to set up and run a Flask project, connect and style Jinja templates, how to use Playwright to create images, and beautify your Python code with pigments. A code image generator allows you to turn your code snippets into visually appealing images, so you can share your work without worrying about formatting issues, syntax highlighting, or social media character limits. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed, include code examples for the techniques shown. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the search tool on realpython.com. So I said I was going to go a little further into the user interface land, and I found this, I don't know, it's kind of like a tour of all the graphical, well, not even all of them, but a pretty good selection of the Python GUI libraries. Most of them I'd heard of, a couple new ones in here. But I like that there's sort of a little bit of a comparison, a little bit of code shown. This is on the website Python GUIs. The title is Which Python GUI Library Should You Use? And the subtitle being Comparing the Python GUI Libraries Available in 2025. It's by Martin Fitzpatrick. So big sign, in fact, pretty shortly down after the first couple paragraphs is a TLDR. If you're looking to build professional quality software, start with PySide 6 or PyQt 6. Qt is how it's spelled, but Qt is the framework. It's very much a batteries included, whatever your project, and then links to his tutorials and his book and videos and so forth. So, this is giving you a tour, but this person has a lot of work and time invested into the PyQt library, which is okay. Keep that in mind.
Little caveat with that, it's mixed licensed. So
Yes.
if you're doing it professionally, you might owe someone money. So
we'll talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Make sure you read those terms before you sign up.
Actually, I might turn this in a little bit of discussion based upon some of these things, like which ones you've used or not used. And I believe Textual, going back to the TUI thing, is pretty open as far as its use. Anyway, it starts with TK inter. TK is the original library, but TK inter, it comes with most distributions of Python. It's sort of built in. Guido worked on this, from what I understand, back in the day. It's a nice, fairly simple library. It has a lot of the standard stuff that you need in it. It's not the most modern looking, but it has tab views, progress bars, all the types of widgets you might want to look at inside there. Again, in this particular article, they give you a very, very simple app and a short piece of code of how to create that in a standard layout or a class-based type layout, like a Hello World kind of thing. If you would like a deeper dive on that, we have one that was included in the Python Basics book by David Amos. And we have that not only as a written tutorial, but Darren Jones has turned it into a video course. So if you're interested in checking out TK Inter, pretty quickly, we get right to PyQt or PySide. And his advice is it's the best one for commercial, multimedia, scientific, or engineering desktop applications. And again, this one is, I think, a heavier library. It requires a little bit more sort of installation and setup, but it has a little bit more power behind it. His advice is, again, that it's probably the best one as far as it having most of the things that you'd want, as far as like being able to do graph plotting, model view controller, MVC type of stuff, with it, multimedia playback, those types of interfaces, and it can build real commercial quality applications. This is based around a C++ library, I think is where it originally started. Leodonis went on a real deep dive at Real Python in 2020, 2021. And I think there's about 5 different tutorials that go into all these different areas, along with things like a tic-tac-toe game to a variety of other kinds of applications and stuff you want. And then like an entire course on like how to do the layouts and how you might want to organize your app. So lots of resources there. And a few of those have been turned into video courses also. So if you're interested, have you used that one?
I've lost track. Qt?
Yeah, Qt.
I've only done reading on that one. I at one point in time I was heading down that path, but I haven't actually coded anything with it. I did some research at some point and then got distracted with another project.
Yeah.
But that was years ago.
Yeah, I kind of stopped when I had to do a lot of additional installation for more advanced stuff with it. And I was like, now I got to I can't just pip install this, which was a little, I think they might have updated that a little bit, but.
It's a Python wrapper to a commercial widget library. And it's even deeper than that. Like Qt's got like database interfaces and networking and a whole bunch of other stuff. It really is like an application development toolkit.
Yeah.
So you get a lot of power. But yeah, it's...
The licensing might be interesting depending on what you're trying to do. Yeah.
Yeah, as long as you're doing open source. So it's been a long time since I've looked at this. This may have changed. Someone in the comments can tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But at one point in time, open source was allowed. Like it was dual license. So if you're building open source applications with it, no problem. If you're building commercial applications with it, then you need a license to the underlying Qt library.
Yeah. The one that he mentions next is interesting. It's sort of an offshoot, which is so PyQt and PySide with QML. And this one he's mentioning is good for using with like Raspberry Pi or microcontrollers. So something that might work with your embedded electronics. I haven't done that deep dive on that, but gosh, there's so many interesting little TFT little screens and so forth that you can get, or OLED screens for electronics today. So if you're looking for a library that works with those types of things, maybe that might be a good one there. Also, the next one is one that I think it was just last time we did a show together, you talked about Kivy.
Yep. I've done a little bit of this. I've played with it. Nothing commercial, but yeah.
Yeah. So Kivy is... I think a lot of people think of it as, that's the one you can do mobile stuff with, but it works on Windows, Mac, works on kind of everything. And then it also can be on mobile. So it can be working on Android or iOS, which is nice. And so it's nice to have a library that can kind of work across all those different platforms. We have a really good tutorial on that. And again, another video course, if you're interested, that dives into it.
its philosophy is mobile first, which
Yeah.
is actually necessary because a lot of GUI will assume things like mouse over
Right.
or things like that, which you can't do in mobile. And even those that will do cross-platform won't support things like pinching and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so Kibby starts there, and then the other libraries hey, yeah, it'll work here too, because pretty much anything you can do that way, you can also do with a mouse. So
Yeah.
the reason they're thought of as the mobile answer is because they actually are the right place to start if you're doing mobile.
The next one that I've played with quite a bit, I was going to do a course on it, is WX Python. And this one is kind of geared more, again, for portable desktop applications, meaning that you want to make an application that'll run across, Windows or Mac or Linux. The thing that I liked about it probably the most is that it had a very large library of widgets. In fact, a nice tool inside of the library itself where you can kind of open it up as a default application and kind of play with them all and decide like, well, what kind of widgets do I want here? Everything from sliders and buttons and players and all kinds of interesting stuff. So our article was by Mike Driscoll on Real Python. It's a very good introduction to get you into it if you're interested in checking that one out. So the next two I haven't played with at all. The next one is PyG object. It has some in parentheses GTK plus, and it's designed for developing applications on the GNOME desktop, GNOME, which is a Linux distribution.
It's actually not a distro. It's a desktop that sits on top of a distro.
Okay, interesting.
Again, it's been a while since I played with this stuff, but like at one point in time, if you were running Red Hat, you could pick, I want KDE or I want GNOME.
Oh, okay.
And GTK is like the underlying.
So that's giving you its own graphical user interface on top of Linux.
Yeah. So in Unix worlds, the desktop is actually a running program that is separated from the underlying mechanism.
Okay.
And there's layers to it. So there's X, which is kind of like the server of it to a certain extent.
Okay.
And then you've got different implementations of desktops that sit on top of it. And GNOME is one of I think it's the most popular. It and KDE used to fight it out all the time. And then GTK is like the underlying widget library that goes with it. It also gets used outside of that as well. So if I remember correctly, things like the GIMP photo manipulation is built on top of GTK.
Yeah, they mentioned that.
So even if you're running that in Mac, you're still using the underlying widget library. You can still use the underlying widget library. Okay.
So this desktop is still the current thing. If you install Debian, you just...
Yeah, I can never remember which ones it comes with. So some, it's like the default for certain ones. For others, It'll give you a choice when you install Linux, which one you want. For some, it's available as like an after add-on. So like you can go in and say, no, I want to use this one instead and basically install it over top. So yeah, it gives you choice.
Okay. The last one that is mentioned is Remi, REMI. And this is more geared toward making web-based UIs for Python applications. Remi is standing for Remote Interface. I have not played with this one at all. It looks kind of interesting, but looks a little bit like you're kind of running a little browser instance for it. So there are links to all of the libraries and links to either sort of discussion groups or other threads that are inside there. So it's a nice resource, kind of a bit of a tour. I would steer people probably toward tkinter because it's a nice place to start. It comes with Python. And then if you decide, well, I need this features or these other kinds of things, then you might look at this list and say, these are the types of things that I need it to accomplish. What's weird about all of this is I think this is important if you are distributing an application. We talked about this idea of like working in an office and you want to be able to give the work that you've created to another user, give them something to be able to run and so forth. And maybe they're not a command line interface type of person. This would give you this option of like, building a simple interface or maybe something even more elaborate or, even a complete application if you wanted to distribute it. But I feel like the web has kind of come in and changed that for a lot of people. And so it depends if your office allows you to access, if you're only allowed to access an intranet or you're allowed to go outside that. I think it's one of these things where I don't know about the popularity of GUIs in today. I don't know. What is your thought on it?
Yeah, the management of installed applications on desktop is hard.
Yeah.
The more machines you've got at a corporate workspace, now you've got to keep them all the same, and all that kind of stuff is painful. So this was definitely the answer 25 years ago.
Yeah.
With the increased capability of the web, it's a heck of a lot easier to install it in one place and then have everybody point their browser at it. Where you'll still find it useful is typically in like really heavy applications. So if you're doing something that's
like a drawing program or something like that.
Yeah, or anything that's doing like a lot of data crunching, like that line has shifted, right? So
sure.
10, 15 years ago when JavaScript couldn't do that much and the browsers weren't as capable, that line was a lot more demarked. It's shifted, right? So, it used to be, you want drag and drop, you got to have it's a desktop thing. And then all of a sudden we got that drag and drop inside of the browser. And lots of luck getting into work. But anyways. So that line is kind of blurry. There are still commercial applications they are increasingly trying to do things like run Photoshop in browsers, and you can-ish, but it's still not quite as useful as actually having it down, right? There are video editors, for example, in the browser. I still use a desktop application for that because when you're doing the heavy stuff, right? So it all kind of depends on what your need is.
Yeah, it's an interesting time. I mean, to kind of come into this, but I still think there is a need, and it's definitely a great way to show your work. Mm-hmm. Or share your work with other people. Hence why you might be interested in them. And that's why I think Textual is an interesting wrinkle in that.
And a lot of the concepts translate, right? So if you're doing, what the idea of a widget, the idea of an event loop, the idea of event handling, all that kind of stuff translates across pretty much any graphical anywhere, right? So in fact, it was one of the things I used, not TK Inter, but TK with the Tickle scripting language when I was in university. And so when CSS first came out, I was always just banging my head against the wall going, this isn't how you define the layout of something. This is wrong. This is the wrong approach. There's 30 years of software in how you do this. Why didn't you try to mimic one of those programs? CSS has gotten better. But it's kind of, when you, the more recent addition of things like flow boxes and that kind of thing, that should have been there from the beginning. And, TK has that, right, built in. Yeah. And it was playing with it in the 80s, right? So,
you resize the window and you're okay.
Yeah. I know. I'm an old man. So there we go. Anyway, I did, just out of curiosity to confirm, I did look up Textual's license and it is MIT. So you can do whatever you want with it.
Great. RealPython is launching another intermediate deep dive, cohort-based course, combining our high-quality learning materials with live instructor-led sessions. This new course format is designed to help you dive deeper into Python's core principles with guidance and accountability. There are so many tutorials that cover the basics of Python, but making the leap to advanced concepts and architectural patterns, that's a whole different challenge. This is where most intermediate programs hit a wall, struggling to wrap their heads around complex topics like the object model, decorators, or clean system design. That's why RealPython has designed a new course to bridge the gap and give you the deep technical understanding and practical skills you need to write professional quality Python code. In just 8 weeks, you'll master the advanced patterns and techniques that top Python developers use every day. You'll move beyond Googling snippets or relying on shortcuts to truly understanding Python's powerful object model, advanced functions, and clean design principles. So if you've been looking for a way to go beyond on-demand tutorials and really master Python, we've got something really special for you. This isn't just another online course. It's an immersive 8-week experience, combining live expert instruction, hands-on exercises, and a supportive community. Together, we'll help you tackle real-world challenges and become the Python developer you've always aspired to be. To learn more, visit realpython.com/workshops, or you can find a link in the show notes. The upcoming Intermediate Python Deep Dive is filling up right now and starts April 28th. Remember, the course is cohort-based. You'll join a small focused group of learners. Each day, you'll receive structured learning materials, meet with your instructor during weekly live classes, stay engaged and accountable by participating in daily discussions in the dedicated online community, and twice a week, join live Q&A sessions with your instructor for extra guidance if you need it. So again, check out realpython.com/workshops. to learn more about the upcoming Intermediate Python Deep Dive course. All right, well, speaking terminals, what do you got for us next?
We do seem to have a little bit of a theme flowing today.
Yep.
My next article is by Julia Evans, who we've covered some of her stuff before, including in episode 182, where we highlighted her great articles, plural, on using Git. This one is called Rules That Terminal Programs Follow, with rules in quotation marks. And it's all about the conventions that programs usually follow. Large percentage of Python programming is command line scripts. So knowing this stuff and following these conventions will make your program less surprising to its users. The rules are something she just sort of made up, and they're not hard and fast. You don't have to follow them, but it's helpful if you do. So there are 7 rules, which go from there's actually 8 rules that go from 1 to 7, but we'll get to that second. So rule number 1 is non-interactive programs should quit when you press Control-C. Rule number 2, speaking of TUIs should quit when you press Q. Rule number 3, REPLs should quit when you press Control-D on an empty line. Rule number 4, don't use more than 16 colors. Rule number 5, vaguely support readline key bindings. Rule 5.1, Control-W should delete the last word. Rule 6, disable colors when writing to a pipe. And Rule 7, dash means standard in, standard out. So some of that may have sounded like nonsense, but we'll cover some of it. We'll see how it goes. So the article starts out with a bit of history explaining why we have this much consistency, and then reiterates that these really are guidelines. Then next is a section on the fact that it isn't always clear whether it's actually your program's responsibility or not to implement any given rule. So for example, Control-C pretty much comes for free unless you explicitly do something to take that power away. For Python, rule number 3, Control-D exits the REPL, also done for you. And if you're writing your own REPL and it sits on top of one of the Python ones, then that's another freebie, right? So sometimes this is something you have to do explicitly, sometimes it isn't. Rule 5 and 5.1 talk about readline key bindings. This is how the editing of text in your input works. Sometimes this is a deliberate choice. Sometimes this is in the underlying input library that you're using. And I might be wrong about this, but sometimes I think your shell can help here as well. So it can be messy. Readline is a specific library, but lots of input libraries mimic this same behavior. So this is where some of this consistency comes from. So if you've ever hit Control-A to get to the beginning of a line, that comes from this library. And so if you're using readline itself or something like it that mimics it, the Control-A, Control-W, Control-E, those kinds of things, that's where this stuff comes from. And all those control sequences are what Emacs is used. So you may not be old like us, but you are still using history. The TUI and color rules, at least in the Python world, mean you're going to have to explicitly implement some library. In that case, it really is up to you to limit your palette to 16 colors and have Q mean quit. Colors work through control codes that are sent to the terminal, which are non-printable characters. Rule 6 says to turn these off when your program is interacting with another program through a Unix pipe. That way, the color codes don't get transmitted to the other program. Although I've used colors a bit, I've honestly never checked whether the Python libraries that I use this with will turn that off automatically or whether you would actually have to detect it. Now I have to go dig up one of my old programs and see what happens when I stick it in a pipe.
As far as like sending them back and forth?
Sending it back and forth, yeah. Okay. So this leads us to rule 7, which is kind of related. So dash means standard in, standard out. So this is a convention where if your program takes a file name, and instead of passing in a file name, you pass in a dash, it's supposed to use standard in and or standard out, depending on what it's trying to do. So this is typically combined with a Unix pipe to link programs together. So Julia gives the example of pb paste pipe black dash pipe pb copy. So pb paste and pb copy are tools on a Mac for getting stuff in and out of your clipboard. So what I just said on a Mac will run the black formatter, taking its input from the clipboard and then sending its output to the clipboard because of those pipes. So the dash basically says use standard in, and then because of the pipes taking over the values of standard in and standard out, PB paste and PB copy take those over, and all of it kind of gets chained together. So this rule is very helpful if your code might be used with other Unix commands, but I'm guessing this is one of the less frequently implemented guidelines. And if you're not needing to chain these things together, it's really not all that important. So, like with all of them, following these rules can make your program easier to use, and in the case of things like pipes, more powerful, as it means it will behave well with other programs. Article's definitely worth a read. Julia also has some other posts in this vein on how terminal escape sequences work, what ASCII control characters are, and more. Always fun reading her stuff. And although it isn't Python specific, a lot of it is sort of the general programmer use stuff.
Yeah, she's been on a terminal kick lately.
Yeah, she seems to have been doing a fair amount of that. There were 3 or 4 of her last 6 or 7 articles have been something in terminal land.
Yeah.
And understanding how some of these things work, because your program's probably being called in a terminal, might help your program be easier to use by others.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, that takes us into projects. This one's a little bit of a follow-up, but I liked it so much as a project that I'm like, all right, I'm going to make it my project this week. So I spoke to Al Swigert last episode, and we talked about Python libraries. He's doing a PyCon talk about audio and video inside of Python, and he has a section about speech to text, so something like Whisper AI. But he also wanted to talk about the other direction of taking text and turning it into speech, and so he mentioned a particular library. And a listener, Ramiro Gomez, sent out an email to me and said, hey, you should check out edge-tts. It's by a GitHub user, Rainy, R-A-N-Y-2, Rainy2. Its subtitle does most of the work here. Use Microsoft Edge's online text-to-speech service from Python, all caps, without needing Microsoft Edge or Windows or an API key. And that was very interesting to me, because this is obviously something that was built by Microsoft to help with Edge and doing online text-to-speech and so forth. But this worked great on my Mac. It was really nice. I was able to install it. You can choose to install it, like in a standard way using UV or pip, or you can use it in sort of more of that application style of like a pipx or a UVX. So you have the command available all the time. I decided to use UVX, and it worked pretty well. The instructions for installation are kind of all there for you. And the setup is pretty straightforward. You use a series of parameters to define, okay, what is your text input? Are you just going to type something and want to have it create it? Choose what the output will be. Okay, I want it to make like an MP3 file. What is the voice you'd like if you want to add that as a flag? And then boom, there you go. It's ready to go. There are like 300 different voices available, including different languages, different genders. I think you'll find something that you'll like inside there. There's a link to this other thing called SSML, Speech Synthesis Markup Language. And so this is something that's going to give you a little bit deeper control over the pronunciation with like custom lexicon of, even though it's written that way, it should be pronounced that way. Hence like PyCute or something like that. You can go in and kind of set those things and kind of control it. My wife has to do this often. She uses a text-to-speech thing pretty often, and she works in mortgages, and so they get things wrong all as far as pronunciation pretty often. So I'll include a link that goes a little further there. On the GitHub page, it also links to another project that uses this. It's called Podcastify. I'm guessing maybe they meant Podcastify, but there's no I in it. But that's an open source Python alternative to Notebook LM, which I think we maybe mentioned, but this is a thing that literally makes like a podcast out of a text file if you want. It's pretty interesting. Their version of it is pretty convincing, and the idea that you can get an open source Python alternative to that. So I'll include links to all this stuff, but I was impressed by this text-to-speech library.
And at this point, should we simultaneously say, I am not a robot?
Yeah. I didn't use this at all in this particular case. So I think it's so interesting that they add ums and stuff automatically
sounds natural
to the output. Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic.
So what do you got for a project?
I've got a quick project by Luca Cappelletti called Compressed JSON. This is another in my recurring theme of libraries that do exactly what they're called. So for better or worse, JSON has become the de facto transmission standard for data. One of its drawbacks is it's a little verbose, granted, not as bad as XML, but still lots of white space and funky characters. The upside of JSON's verbosity is its compressibility. Of course, if you have compressed it, that means you're going to have to translate it back for it to become a Python dictionary. Normally, this would be a two-step process, but the compressed JSON library does this for you. This library implements the same load and dump interface as the regular JSON library, but has the added benefit of supporting gzip, bzip, lzma, and regular old zip. There's also a couple of handy little features like shortcuts for loading files that are in the same directory as your code, which at first I kind of went, who cares? But then he points out that this is useful if you've got JSON data in your package. So if you've got a module and you've got data that goes with your file, then it's there, which is kind of neat. And then likewise, there's also a cache. So if you need to be running the code multiple times, you can avoid having the uncompressed cost happening over and over again. So if you're playing with compressed JSON data, then the compressed JSON library is definitely worth a look.
Nice. All right. Our schedule coming up is going to be interesting. I know we've talked about it multiple times that we'll be heading off to Dublin and we'll be recording a PyCoders show there. We're also hoping to get a variety of guests that are at the conference and record with them. So stay with us as far as the upcoming schedule. But I'll talk to you soon, Christopher.
Always a pleasure.
All right. I want to thank Christopher Trudeau for coming on the show again. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.